When the first solar flare erupted in 2052, it was nothing more than a routine event, a dazzling display of light and energy. Scientists watched with fascination as the flare lanced outward, its waves of radiation rippling through the solar system. But when the next wave came, something unprecedented happened. The signals emitted by the flare contained patterns, as if they were organized into a coherent sequence. At first, it was dismissed as a coincidence. Solar flares were chaotic, after all. Yet, as more flares erupted, the patterns became undeniably structured. Dr. Luciana Voss, a leading astrophysicist at the International Space Observation Institute, was one of the first to notice the anomalies. The signals from the solar flares weren't random. They seemed to be a message, an encrypted code. After years of exhaustive study, Luciana and her team managed to decode the first fragment of the message. It was clear, a warning from an ancient civilization. The message was ancient, its language archaic, but the meaning was undeniable. The end approaches. You are not the first. The stars burn bright, but their fire consumes. Beware, for the catastrophe has begun. The discovery sent shockwaves through the scientific community. If true, it would mean humanity had received a message from a civilization older than Earth itself. The implications were staggering. An advanced species had communicated from beyond the grave, warning of a calamity that transcended time and space. The solar flares were not just natural events. They were a form of cosmic communication. But as the team continued their work, decoding more fragments of the message, something began to go wrong. Each new message triggered a violent solar flare. The flares grew more intense, more erratic, until they began to destabilize the sun itself. The very act of decoding the message seemed to provoke the sun into violent outbursts, sending waves of radiation and electromagnetic pulses toward Earth. Luciana stood in her lab, staring at the data, her mind racing. She had been so certain that the messages were a gift, a warning that could help humanity survive an impending catastrophe. But now, she realized that every step forward they took to understand the message only made the situation worse. They were unraveling the very fabric of space-time, causing the sun to burn hotter, faster, and more unpredictably. Is it possible that the messages themselves are the catastrophe? Luciana asked, her voice trembling. What if decoding these flares is what brings about the end? Her colleague, Dr. Theo Santiago, looked over the data with a grim expression. He had been the one to decode the most recent message. To warn is to condemn. The cycle cannot be undone. You will destroy your sun. We can't stop now, Theo said, his voice strained. If there's even a chance that these messages can save us, we need to understand them. We need to know what's coming. But Luciana couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line they couldn't return from. Each flare they deciphered brought them closer to understanding the ancient civilization's fate, but it also brought them closer to their own destruction. The messages themselves were causing solar instability. Their very pursuit of knowledge had become a paradox. To decode, the message was to invite catastrophe. To stop decoding would mean ignoring the dire warning that might be their only hope. The sun was beginning to show signs of increasing instability. Solar winds intensified, and Earth's atmosphere began to shimmer with unnatural auroras, signaling that the planet was being bombarded by radiation. The weather patterns became erratic, and electromagnetic disturbances began to interfere with communication and technology. Humanity was already experiencing the effects of the flares, and it was clear that time was running out. Luciana made a difficult decision. She called together the world leaders and the scientific community for an emergency summit. The question on the table was simple. Should they continue to decode the messages, risking the collapse of their sun, Or should they abandon the effort and pray that the remaining fragments held no further warning? The debate was intense, with some advocating for knowledge at any cost, while others argued that survival was the only priority. Luciana argued passionately for caution, but her voice faltered under the weight of the decision. Every argument seemed futile, as if the cosmos itself had conspired to set them on an impossible path. Ultimately, the decision was made to halt the decoding. They would no longer risk angering the sun with their attempts to unravel the message. Instead, they would focus on preparing Earth for the impending disaster. Humanity had to survive the aftermath, whether or not they understood the full extent of the ancient warning. Yet, as Luciana stood in front of the console, the final message flashed before her eyes. To stop is to perish. The truth is the end. The fire will burn until the ashes are gone. There is no choice but to face it. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. There was no escape from the catastrophe. The sun would burn itself out, whether they decoded the messages or not. In their quest for knowledge, they had already set the wheels of fate in motion. The end was inevitable, and there was no way to stop it. The pursuit of knowledge had not saved them, it had sealed their doom. The sun flared again, a violent eruption that sent a shockwave across the solar system. Luciana watched the data unfold before her, the reality of the situation sinking in. The messages had warned them, but in doing so, they had triggered the very destruction they sought to avoid. Now, there was only one thing left: survival. Humanity would face its fate not with understanding, but with the raw resilience of those who have been warned too late. The cost of knowledge had been high, and the price for survival was even higher.